one day at a time.
It's that real this time around. Lock and load.
Get on your knees.
This is the point of no return. I can never go back. Life without parole, upstate, shackled and trapped. Living in the hole, looking at the world through a crack. That I'd rather shoot it out and get clapped. I've gone too far, there ain't no coming back for me. Auschwitz gas chamber full of Zyklon B.
Welcome to Orwellian Optics, the podcast that clarifies modern finance through a macro lens. Brought to you by Alio Capital. We're here to break down how macroeconomics, policy, and political power impact your personal finances and your family's future. Experts agree geopolitics is the biggest risk to your portfolio. We're on a mission to cut through the noise, challenge conventional wisdom of investing, and arm you with the insights you need to stay ahead of the game. Together, let's dissect these critical topics and reclaim control of your freedom and financial future.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Orwellian Optics. I'm Gareth da Cunha, Head of Growth here at Alio Capital. And joining us today is Mark Skousen, PhD in economics from George Washington University, recently named one of the top 20 living economists in the world. And in 2014, he was appointed as a presidential fellow at Chapman University in California. Very notable and prolific author of multiple books on economics, including The Making of Modern Economics, The New Scrooge Investing, The Big Three in Economics, and as well as his most recent book, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, the World's Most Versatile Genius. Thanks for coming on, Mark.
It's a pleasure to talk to you today. There's a lot going on in the world, so it's always fun to talk about what's happening.
Absolutely. But what perked my ears up was kind of one of your newest books, which is on Benjamin Franklin. I'm not 100% sold on being a constructionist. However, I have studied the founding fathers quite exclusively, as well as the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, etc. And it's kind of clear Benjamin was a man among men in terms of intellectual cerebral power from those guys, traveled to France and so on. What piqued your interest in the book? What made you want to focus on Benjamin Franklin specifically?
Actually, it represented about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was asked to do a monthly column for the Franklin Prosperity Report, which is a combination of giving advice on personal finance as well as business and business management. And so I wrote these columns for about 6 years. And by the time I was finished, I said, wow, I have a whole book here. So it's not really a biography. It's not a typical biography that gives the life of Ben Franklin from beginning to end. Lots of books have been written by Warren Isaacson and H.O. Brands and others. This is a book that is taking Franklin's life and ideas and work and applying it to today in personal finance, business, acumen, diplomacy, government policy, healthy living. He lived to be 84. He was a generation older than all the other founders, and in so many ways was the most famous American of his time. And in fact, without the American Revolution, you really wouldn't know much about Washington or Jefferson or Adams or any of those people, but you would know a lot about Ben Franklin. He's considered one of the 100 most important scientists for his experiments in electricity. He's famous as an inventor. He was America's first American in many ways, first scientific American, first postmaster general, first financial guru, and in some ways, America's first economist. He had a lot to say about inflation and prosperity and laissez-faire and the role of government and so forth. So I called him the greatest American because of the subtitle, The World's Most Versatile Genius. I came up with 22 careers. So he was a jack of all trades and the master of most.
Renaissance man, certainly. So you've made kind of a career of applying and really digging deep into the great intellectuals within economics. I was wondering if I could see that, you kind of pick your brain and see what that lens looks like with Benjamin Franklin to today, particularly around laissez-faire, particularly around fiscal policy and so on. Were he here now, the cliche question, what do you think he'd say? What do you think his thoughts would be?
Well, at one point he said, I wished I was lived 200 to 300 years later, which would be nowadays, and he would be thoroughly blown away by the technological advances, the new technologies. He'd have a cell phone, he'd be texting, he'd be into AI, he would be into all of that sort of thing. So that he would be very impressed with. However, I think he would be quite shocked by the size and scope of government, the national debt, and inflation, permanent inflation that we live in. It's mind-boggling to see the role that government has played. It's certainly not laissez-faire, which he advocated. He was a big fan of Adam Smith's laissez-faire policy, system of natural liberty. I'll give you two quotes from Franklin that are not very from most people haven't heard. It's not like early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, and a penny saved is a penny earned. These are quite well-known sayings by Franklin. But the two ones I like that would apply to today, he would say, a virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. So do we have cheap government today? Well, most people would say no. And what does that say about us as an industrious and virtuous people? Maybe we have to look ourselves in the mirror a little bit when it comes to the profligate government spending and welfare systems and inflation and out of control deficits and that sort of thing. The other quote is really quite idealistic. He said, "The system of America is commerce with all and war with none." And it seems like we're violating a lot of that today with the Fortress America policies the Trump administration is following, and certainly wars are always going to be with us. And America has been involved in a lot of different wars over the years. So I like those two quotes. I think Franklin would have mixed feelings about today. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I like the first quote because it points the finger at government as well as at ourselves, and requires a level of accountability that we've always been big believers in, at least within our own doors here at Alio Capital, around being an industrious people makes you cheap to govern. But which came first, the chicken or the egg, active government, or that we started to slip around our own industrious nature? There's an interesting layer of accountability that cuts both ways on that one.
I've always, when I wrote my book, The Making of Modern Economics, I found that all the economic theories came out of experiences, the crises of that age. The Industrial Revolution brought about the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. The Industrial Revolution, the bad side of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century brought the reaction of Karl Marx and the Marxists and the socialists. The Great Depression of the 1930s gave us John Maynard Keynes, and the recovery in the 20th century gave us Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and people who had a more positive view of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of the next direction I wanted to kind of dig into is we've talked about the size of government. We've also talked about kind of personal accountability and so on. The great modern American economic debate between, say, Keynes and Hayek, or you could say Keynes and Friedman and the monstrous, if you wanted to go Chicago school, were you so inclined. I'd be curious, in your idea, where do we stand now? Where were we previously, and where are we headed in terms of a balance towards, say, free market Keynes or free market Hayek and Friedman versus, say, Keynesian traditional economics? Are we still Keynesians now?
Well, in so many ways we are, because we do live under big government. It's not pure socialism. It's not totalitarianism, but it's not laissez-faire either. It's that middle of the road big government, which means slow growth. You do protect the you have a welfare system and lots of ways to protect this. You have a very activist government stimulus during recessions and crises. All of that is Keynesian economics. But unfortunately, when the good times come, the side of being more prudent in running surpluses never seems to occur. this is the drawback to Keynesian economics. You've left the barn door open in the back, and all the cattle are leaving. I think that's a good suggestion of what's going on in the world today, where we are at close to full employment, and we're running $1 to $2 trillion deficits. Our national debt is expanding. And even the latest information about the UK having to raise interest rates and facing a bit of a mini crisis with the fall of the British pound and so forth. This is kind of anticipating more problems, especially in the United States, which is the world's largest debtor of $37 trillion and continuing to grow despite DOGE and efforts to curtail government spending. We've entered an era of permanent inflation. That's the legacy of Keynes. Permanent deficit spending, that's also a legacy. Welfare state, big government, and slow growth. All of those are legacies of Keynes. If you had adopted a Hayekian point of view, you would have balanced budget. It's more of a classical. Hayek was a defender of the classical model and very much in opposition to Keynes. I don't know if you've heard that rap song that millions of people have seen about Keynes and Hayek debating. I thought that was a very good job of describing the big debate of today is not really Keynes and Milton Friedman, although Friedman played a very important role, and I have a chapter on Milton Friedman and his monetary policies played a very important role. But I do kind of like the Hayek versus Hayek versus Keynes debate that the rap song portrays.
It is clever, and I highly recommend everyone watch it. It's well done, and it's clearly done by people who are very literate in the history of economic thought and the Austrian versus the Keynesian school, and even the Chicago school as well. And that kind of leads me to my next question. And more than probably or close to anybody in the world, you're more literate in most of the economic thinkers throughout history than pretty much any other intellectual out there, if you'll allow me to say. Do you have a specific, if you had to pick one who was probably most misunderstood or most falsely quoted, was there one that kind of jumps out to you as being taken over by people who didn't really read the core works? The reason I bring it up is that rap song that you mentioned. It's very clear that that Hayek was actually the better intellectual. However, Keynes just keeps winning over and over and over again, even though his policies are soundly defeated over and over. I'd be curious what your thoughts were on a particular economic thinker who has been either vastly misunderstood or poorly interpreted by the modern zeitgeist.
Well, I do think a lot of economists who have asked that question have their own pet economist that deserves more exposure, shall we say. And there's two of them that come to mind in my book, The Making of Modern Economics, that I highlighted that is not in Heilbronner's book and a lot of other histories of thought. And that's the French laissez-faire school, particularly of Jean-Baptiste Say, S-A-Y, and Say's law, which is easily misunderstood. It's commonly known as supply creates demand. And I actually have a fun exercise with my students at Chapman and elsewhere where we have a debate between Say's law and Keynes's law. So Keynes's law is demand creates supply, and then Say's law is supply creates demand. And I said, so just from a common sense point of view, students, without knowing anything more about Say's law versus Keynes' law, which makes more common sense? Well, usually about 90% of the students say Keynes' law. Right? You got to have the demand there. Why would you possibly create a product that there isn't any demand for? And then I spend time explaining what Say meant. He came from an agricultural community, and he found that when there was a really good harvest, everybody was spending money. The supply created the demand. And when there was a poor harvest, nobody spent money, and they all pulled in their reins and stopped spending. So, and then I use examples of cities like Seattle. I said, why is Seattle rich? Well, is it because consumers reached in their pockets and spent a lot of money and took out debt and credit cards and so forth? No, it's because entrepreneurs came up with great new ideas. Microsoft, Boeing, Amazon, Costco, the list goes on and on about companies that were created. And the catalyst of that creation was coming up with new ideas. Or Starbucks, that was another one I mentioned. So that was the catalyst. So supply creates demand. So by the time I'm finished, the students flip. 90% think that Say's law makes more sense if you want economic growth. So Say is one of them. The other one is Max Weber, who considered himself an economist. Most people consider him a sociologist. He was famous for his book on the spirit of capitalism and the Protestant ethic. And I use him, I add him as a kind of a contrarian to Thorstein Veblen. All the economics textbooks have Thorstein Veblen as institutionalist who's critical of capitalism. I said, we need a defender of capitalism in the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, and that turns out to be Max Weber. So those are two people that I think have been underappreciated in the economics literature, and I have them in my economic logic textbook, and I also have them in my book, The Making of Modern Economics. So those would be two examples.
I particularly like Say as an example. He's a much understated and under-referenced economist of his day, and more than once I've found that kind of these modern blogs or some innovative writer thinks they've discovered something new, and then you just reference Say quite quickly in the comments, and they are briefly humbled, which I quite enjoy. But you didn't hear that from me. All right. So I wanted to kind of dig deeper into, again, because of your kind of academic acumen and literacy within the nature of the global economy. Tell me a little bit about gross output. I know that's something that you have spent a lot of your academic career discussing, innovating, creating, and then also lay the scene on how gross output stands next to GDP and how one could potentially be a red herring versus the other when making economic decisions and so on. I was curious if you kind of lay the scene for us and then talk us through gross output individually.
Yeah, I came up with the idea of gross output because of my dissatisfaction with GDP and all of the distortions that GDP causes. And one of the biggest problems is that GDP supports a Keynesian mindset that consumer spending drives the economy. It's basically Keynes' law instead of Say's law. But my gross output is more sympathetic with Say's law, and with this emphasis on the supply side, the emphasis on business rather than the consumer as the key catalyst for economic growth. My gross output statistic also is very aligned with the solo growth model. The solo growth model says that technology is the primary motivator for economic growth, not consumer spending. Consumption is the effect, not the cause of prosperity. So what is the cause of prosperity? Well, it's entrepreneurship, it's innovation, it's technology, it's capital investment, it's productive savings. All of the things that I just listed are on the supply side, not the demand side of the economy. And so I have for some time advocated that we need some kind of a measure that gives the proper balance between consumption and production and business and consumer spending. And the balance is created with the development of gross output. So what is gross output? Well, gross output is a measure of spending at all stages of production. So it kind of comes out of Hayek and some other economists who had these stages of production that Menger emphasized in his Principles, Grundsatz textbook. And we don't really spend much time on that. If you pick up most textbooks, they simply talk about GDP, and GDP measures final output only. So it's the finished product. It doesn't really talk much about the supply chain. It doesn't talk about all those intermediate stages of production to produce the cell phone, to produce the podcast that we're on, my hat, our clothing, our glasses, all of those things. How important is that supply chain? And should we measure it? And gross output includes the supply chain. So it's GDP plus the value of the supply chain. And GO is more than double the size of GDP, as you might expect. The biggest complaint by economists is, well, this is just double counting. But double counting counts because you change location, you change the product itself, you change used goods are in gross output in the intermediate stage. Even the black market shows up that doesn't show up in final output. So it's quite variable. If people go to my website, grossoutput.com, they have all my papers. I do a press release every quarter. And the exciting thing is the federal government, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, they're the ones who put out GDP. In 2014, they decided, following my advice, I wrote about this initially in a book called The Structure of Production. It came out in 1990, published by NYU Press. And so in 2014, after badgering the BEA, I said, you really need a top line and a bottom line of national income accounting, just like financial statements. The top line is sales. The bottom line is net income. Why can't we do that for national income accounting? It makes perfect logical sense. And one of the reasons I discovered GO is because as a business person, I was very familiar with financial statements where you have sales as the top line and the bottom line is net profit. You can't have profit without sales. So to me, it's really important to have that. And then I looked at national income accounting. I say, well, they just have the bottom line. They don't have the top line. So the top line is gross output, sales at all stages of production. GDP is the bottom line. And look, they're complementary. I'm not replacing GO. I'm not replacing GDP with GO. I'm suggesting we need both of them as proper measures. And they move very differently, especially during a downturn. Gross output drops much more sharply and recovers much more quickly, as you'll see on the charts if you go to grossoutput.com. So the other thing that I discover with gross output is that business spending is much bigger. It's twice as big as consumer spending. So unfortunately, when you go to the financial media and so on, it's all about retail sales. It's what's the consumer doing? What is consumer expectations? No. It's important, but it's only a third of the economy. 2/3 of the economy is business spending. And if you look at the 10 leading economic indicators, almost all of them are located in the supply chain, in the business sector, so including the stock market. So I've had a lot of fun with this. Unfortunately, it's a very slow slog. Despite being endorsed by 3 or 4 Nobel Prize winning economists, it's still hard to recognize. It's not in the textbooks except my own. The economists are really slow when it comes to making a change of something as simple as top line, bottom line accounting in national income accounting.
That's fascinating. So we at Alio are big believers in trying to separate the noise from the signal in terms of what's going on in the financial data and what's going on in financial headlines, et cetera. We totally share your thesis in that so much ink is we would say falsely spilled on, did this particular company outperform this other particular company in one particular quarter, when the macro indicators show that that whole sector is about to get absolutely destroyed, or the opposite, that all of the tailwinds are showing that this particular sector is going to do extremely well. regardless of which position you own in that particular sector, own them all, you're better served to lean into macro factors like gross output as a function of GDP versus
Yeah. And
individual or say headline numbers like GDP and so on that can be sometimes distorted or manipulated by particular sectors or what have you, or they perhaps ignore, to your point, 2/3 of the economy and 2/3 of the spending that takes place in the economy.
yeah, in fact, one of the things that's interesting is that gross output is growing at a slower rate than GDP and has been for over a year. Business spending, B2B spending, has actually been rather moribund for the last year. Maybe it'll start picking up, I don't know, but it does indicate slow, stagflation type of economy, despite what you're seeing in the stock market and doing really well. Which, by the way, I'm fully invested at this point, but I'm also in gold, and gold has done really well. In fact, it's outperformed almost every other index recently.
It absolutely has. We're big believers in gold, and we even have some opportunities to invest in Bitcoin, which is the digital gold, if you ally to that particular mindset. That's fascinating. Is there a specific reason that you would attribute gross output being so different to our GDP numbers right now? Is there a specific trend line you're seeing that you'd highlight?
Yeah, one of the problems was the supply chain was really disconnected as a result of 2020 COVID and the shutdown of the economy. I think it's been a very good experience for government to realize you can't just shut down the supply chain and shut down businesses and then say, oh, we made a mistake. Okay, open up. The supply chain struggled with shortages that lasted for some time because of the interconnection with inventories and production processes that you have, and the globalization that is so important. So I think it's just the after effect of the 2020 COVID that we're finally it's taking 3 or 4 years to finally the supply chains to get back to normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you predict a boom and pent up demand with corporate spending? Do you think we're headed towards another lost decade or moment of stagflation, if you had to guess?
Well, it's interesting because their gross output never showed a recession during the entire 2021 period. It was just slow growth, just gradually trying to recover. And so I don't know if we'll see a big boom going on, catching up. It's just been a very gradual process, and it's taken a long time to happen. So I'm not predicting a recession necessarily. I do think that we do have some serious challenges, including the national debt crisis that I think is gradually developing here, and we're going to have to confront that.
That's interesting. And to circle back to your previous statement about being fully invested and having some exposure to gold, it just goes to show no matter what regime you're in, growth, inflation, deflation, recession, what have you, there's an opportunity to make some hay if you know you are and you allocate appropriately. That's an interesting insight. My kind of last question, something I'd really like to pick your academic brain on, is that because you're so exposed to 4 or 5 different sectors of the world, I think you've been heavily involved in business, you've been heavily involved in academia, you spent quite a bit of time in Washington, or at least advising Washington from a policy standpoint. If you had to really grab America by the shoulders and shake it and deliver an uncomfortable truth that would be some tough love, or would deliver a huge amount of value, even though it's not popular, or even though it wouldn't necessarily be taken well, or could never actually be implemented practically, I'd be curious what that would be, just because you have so much context through which to look at the modern moment.
Well, it's hard to pinpoint one specific area. I mean, I hate to say this, but globalization right now is not particularly popular. I mean, if you consider what the Trump administration is doing, and it's just shocking to me, top economists kowtowing to President Trump in favor of the Fortress America. I prefer that over America First. I think it's a Fortress America type of policy that the Trump administration is pursuing, and it's very anti-free trade. I mean, several countries have come back already and said, listen, we'll reduce tariffs to zero. Vietnam offered that. India has offered that. And Trump has rejected those. So don't tell me that the ultimate goal is to lower tariffs across the board. I don't think that's what's going on here. And the evidence is very strong, I think, that globalization has accelerated economic growth and improved the lives of billions of people all over the world, including the Chinese and people that we are now supposed to be our enemy. We need to be very careful on what this pursuit to fight against free trade. Certainly, if the results are reducing barriers for American goods being exported as well as imports, I'm all in favor of it. I just don't see that end game occurring. The other thing that we have to get a hold of is we have to adopt the public choice, the two amendments to the Constitution that are advocated by the public choice economists of James Buchanan, and others, and that is a balanced budget amendment, and we also need a tax limitation amendment. These are two defects in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There's nothing there that promotes a balanced budget and excessive taxation. I do think that those are two areas that we really need to work on. And then finally, I think it's unfortunate we're seeing so much brainwashing on the climate change debate. I ask my students, I say, okay, by show of hands, how many of you think that since 1960, pollution has gotten worse? Has it gotten better or worse since 1960 in Southern California, where I teach at Chapman University? And every time, the majority of these students say it's gotten worse since 1960. And then I show them a chart showing that automobile use has risen dramatically since 1960, but pollution, air pollution and water pollution has dropped 97%. I mean, this is an eye-opener to demonstrate how so far brainwashed students have become into the climate crisis that we're facing. And look, there's marginal change. There's no question about it that global warming is occurring, and the evidence is pretty strong. But do we go to the extreme measures of banning fossil fuels and stuff like that? The extremism is just something, that's the inconvenient truth, if you wanted to use Al Gore's term.
I think that's a wonderful point. There is almost no measure on the planet by which the human condition has worsened in the last 20, 40, 50, pick a time frame. Deaths by water, poisoned water, all kinds of things.
Well, I do think there are, I agree in general, economic issues and so forth, but I do think there's cultural decline. I don't think we're reading as much as we used to. We look at the entertainment, the cultural changes, and the classical music is on decline. Language is on decline. Foul language is on the rise. There's a lot of, people not living with two parents. There's a lot of issues culturally that I think we can say there is decline. But you're right, economically, we've seen a tremendous advance across the board, and the number of people in poverty has declined rather significantly over the 200 years. So I don't think everything is better, but certainly I think most of the economic indicators suggest that we're better off.
Right. And the name of the podcast is Orwellian Optics for an absolute reason, because of kind of the brainwashing that you referenced, and that there are so many opportunities and facets by which the world has gotten so much better, but they're not necessarily getting talked about, and they're not necessarily getting shown the light that they deserve in the same way. And so you end up with a distorted view in the same way that, for example, GDP gives you a distorted view versus gross output, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as far as truths go, those three are quite good. So thank you for sharing those. Any last minute thoughts before we sign off?
I just finished reading, one of the things that I know one of your questions was about FreedomFest and the conference that I do every year. And we're excited about going back to Las Vegas next year, July 8th through the 11th at Caesars Forum Convention Center. And our theme is, it's the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. So Think Independent is our theme. And our claim to fame is that we do at least a dozen debates. These are civil debates. These are formal debates. So you don't talk over each other, and you hopefully don't yell at each other, and you give different points of view. And we're just very excited about having that sort of debate on all of these different issues. A lot of people read only their point of view. And I would urge everybody who's listening to broaden your horizons, read people that you don't necessarily agree with. I just finished reading the biography or the autobiography, the memoirs of Robert Reich, the former labor secretary under Bill Clinton. And, it was difficult sometimes to listen to his statements that I think were misleading or wrong-headed and so forth, but it was valuable to spend that time. Unfortunately, he doesn't feel the same way. I've invited him to FreedomFest several times. He's simply refused, doesn't give a reason, but you really wonder, where is the civility? Where are the civil debates that we need so much? And that's the kind of thing we do at FreedomFest. So I hope people who are listening will take the time out, the 3 or 4 days that we have in hot Las Vegas. We're indoors, air conditioned. But we really have a great time, and Steve Forbes and John Mackey are co-ambassadors, among others. They're going to be there, as well as a lot of interesting discussions and debates and topics. We're quite excited about it.
Absolutely. At Alio Capital or Orwellian Optics, we're huge advocates for cross aisle communication, cross ideology communication, free and open debate, so that the best ideas can float to the fore. Big believer in your mindset there, and thank you for putting on all that effort. Thanks for your time today, Mark. We appreciate it. It's clear we're kind of in unprecedented economic times, and your perspective around a few of those items around kind of particularly gross output stuck out to me, as well as a couple of those uncomfortable truths are worth taking home. Thank you for joining us, guests. Download the app on Alio Capital, ALLIO. Available on the Apple Play Store as well as the Google Play Store, and also check out Mark's book, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, in the world's most versatile genius. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Be free, as Ben Franklin would say.
As well as us at Alio Capital.
Thanks again for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Be free, think macro, invest smarter by joining the macro revolution with the only investment app powered by Altitude AI. You can join the beta at aliocapital.com. Again, that's aliocapital.com. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a 5-star rating, click like below, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Stay free, and as always, God bless America. This episode has been brought to you by Alio Capital. Get empowered to confidently grow your wealth while strategically managing geopolitical, monetary, and fiscal policy risks. Here at Alio, we combine professional macro investment strategies, personalized portfolio solutions, institutional-grade data, and comprehensive wealth tracking into the only AI-powered financial investment app to help you achieve your financial goals independently. Be free, think macro, invest smarter. For more information, download the app now or visit us at aliocapital.com.